Well, hi, American history class. It is I. So, Dr. Bruce, nice to see you. Oh, there we go. That's a little bit better. You caught me. I'm sitting here drinking coffee and eating a little Chex Mix. So, good snack. I hope you're well. I see that a lot of you saw my posts from the other day, and all the exam scores are up and all that stuff. And then I did post a few quick comments about the exam itself because there had been a number of inquiries. So go and check that out on Converge if you haven't already done so. Just kind of get yourself up to speed. So today we're going to finish talking about the decade of the 1960s, and particularly focus a little bit on a few domestic, a few domestic policies and issues and events that were prominently affecting Americans during that decade. I just want to frame a couple of things that are going to coincide very neatly with what you've been reading in the YOP text. And then on Friday, so Friday Friday, April the 17th, our scheduled topic, we're going to be into the 1970s a little bit more on Friday. I might just introduce the decade a little bit here today, but we're going to be knee deep in the 1970s on Friday. And then next week, we'll be going through the 80s, 90s, and into the 21st century a little bit as we finish off the semester. So for those of you who have not submitted any film reviews yet, you're taking it to the tail end here. So just remember, you've got to finish those. And there are only a couple options left at this point. So just keep that in mind. Also, probably on Friday, as I said in the messages that were sent out from the announcements page on Converge, I plan to post, I should say, a study suggestions guide for the final exam, which will be taking place in about a week and a half. So look for that on Friday. I haven't done it yet, but I'll be posting that later on this week. Okay, so one of the things that we left off and we were talking about, I was trying to get you guys to comprehend a couple of the key situations involved. The civil rights era that we talked about briefly the other day, and that the YOP text has been walking you through as well. Trying to frame a couple of things regarding that, specifically in relation to Lyndon Johnson in the post-Kennedy years, the advent of some really important legislation, specifically the two big ones that you really definitely need to lock in on are the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and that's followed closely the next year by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So we walked through some of those things, and I mentioned in passing that they connected to something we typically refer to as Lyndon Johnson's Great Society reform. So I want to talk about that just briefly. Again, as I chew on my rice Chex, sorry, my lunch was apparently not covering the hunger here. Coffee and rice Chex, there's just nothing quite so good. I told my other class I've got I'm channeling Fred Rogers here, so got my zip up sweater on. I will not be singing a song about any of you being my neighbors, but I have high regard for you, so even if you aren't technically my neighbors. Okay, back to some things here. Let's hone in on the Great Society. So Lyndon Johnson is, in many respects, he tries to harness some of the same impulses, some of the same rhetorical inspiration as FDR had done during the Great Depression. And the idea here is that and I'm just going to be forthright with you, I think both the New Deal legislation, as well as the Great Society, as well as the um, mandated agencies created by the Great Society, that these, in my estimation, were actually not the way to go in some respects, because of the expansion, the massive expansion of the federal government. So for a republic, so the United States was founded as a republic, and within those Republican principles, I'm referring to the concept of a republic, a Republican society. I'm not referring to the political party. So in a Republican society, the goal is to actually allow for as much independence, as much of an entrepreneurial spirit, and to allow the states to determine a great deal regarding their domestic policy, their own markets, things along those lines. It's always been oriented toward those things, or the goal, the original intention of the founders was to have a Republican society that veered sharply away from some sort of a massive bureaucracy. And yet with things like the Great Depression and the New Deal, and here with LBJ's Great Society, there is this move in the opposite direction. So in Lyndon Johnson's estimation, he and his administration, they decided that the federal government should begin to oversee more sectors of American society, and that there should be federal government checks, oversight into a lot of different aspects of our economy, some aspects of education. The idea, in part, there was some merit. I mean, this is when in the Great Society we first began hearing references to the government trying to ensure that, for instance, education was open to all Americans, and to try to make some inroads to ensure that that would happen without infringing on Americans' rights, but at the same time guaranteeing specifically that Black Americans would have equal access to these aspects of life that they had thus far been denied. So some parts of the Great Society contain some noble concepts. There's no doubt about that. The trick here is that when you begin to look at all the different agencies in our government that were created to oversee, a whole slew of American life, a whole number of realities that Americans faced. This is, for me and for many others, this is where the nervousness kind of sets in, because once governments are given power, and that power is expansive, and it's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, it's increasingly difficult to draw it back in, and to kind of rein in government authority and abuse. And so in just a general sense, one of the critiques of LBJ's Great Society reform has always been, from the very beginning, the critics who responded, made these kinds of statements, the concerns revolving around the size of the federal government as it continued to expand. The welfare state that we sometimes reference in the late 20th and now into the 21st century, concerns about how much the federal government should be responsible for the welfare of providing for so many different economic realities and desires of Americans. This was a concern from the beginning, and the Great Society really kicks off this orientation toward the federal government being responsible for an increased percentage of Americans who may not have been working at the time, or maybe were injured, or all the rest. And so the idea that the federal government is going to create agencies that are funded to address Americans who have difficulty. This is one of the things connected to the Great Society. Now, of course, no one doubts that that there can be some really positive fallback, kind of a safety net sort of a deal for those in our midst who who lose jobs for a period of time in their lives and who are having a hard time finding another one, those who may be injured due to employment, who aren't getting the benefits that they might otherwise, who aren't receiving the benefits that they really need to have. Look, those things do exist, but the number of federal agencies created as a result of the Great Society was just on such an expansive level. And over the years, the welfare state has been increased to some pretty strange levels to allow for Americans to essentially live for years and years and years, even those who are physically and mentally capable, to live for years and years and years on a welfare system that is paid for by their fellow American taxpayers. And this is where we get into the critiques of something like the Great Society. So, Johnson won a lot of, in his own party and for certain members of American society, the whole notion of LBJ's reform agenda seemed to be a welcome element. But keep in mind that there were a lot of Americans who were deeply troubled by the emergence of this so-called Great Society, and they were concerned about being able to fund it through, taxation, and whether this was going to actually kind of backfire on Americans in the long term, as far as allowing for, increased federal agencies to exist, number one, but having to fund those agencies primarily through the American taxpayer, and whether it would create a generation of Americans or generations of Americans that were increasingly dependent upon the federal government for their livelihood, for their well-being, rather than taking a much more independent and entrepreneurial approach to life. So that's kind of where the two visions, came together. And look, there are those on both sides of this debate even now, and I'll let you guys just kind of decide where you individually fall. I've always been a bit more of an independent spirit when it comes to American politics in many respects, but I certainly lean towards some more conservative orientations in the year 2020 than I probably thought I would have even 20 years ago. But I get, people like me get nervous when when federal government power increases and expands exponentially and seems to grow out of control. And it has for a long time, regardless of who's been in the White House and who's in charge of the Senate or the House of Representatives or things along those lines. And both the New Deal under FDR and LBJ's Great Society contributed to this expansion of American government in Washington, D.C. Okay, we've already talked about 1968 as far as Vietnam is concerned, so I talked about the Tet Offensive, and I need to mention a couple of other things to you here. But first, I'm going to have another handful of Chex Mix. So I'm going to crunch that real quick, and then I'll talk some more. Snoopy. This mug of Snoopy as the World War I flying ace was a gift from my son this past year. So it's one of my favorite mugs. I think I've shown it to you before, but I don't think I mentioned where I got it. Okay. Cheers as I'm having my coffee. It is just coffee, I promise. So nothing more interesting than that. So 1968. You see in the slide here, I've labeled this as a tumultuous year for Americans. I would probably go further than that. I think 1968 is one of the most tumultuous years in modern history for Americans. And, I honestly can't think of a more tumultuous year for Americans going back probably to the Civil War era. Although the irony is that right now in 2020, 2020 is certainly going to go down as one of the years that was very challenging for the world and all Americans who are living through this weird COVID-19 scenario. But we're still relatively early on, and my hope is that within the next month, at the most, within the next month or so, that we will see some move a little bit back towards some normalcy and the restarting of the American economy and stuff like that. So my hope is that 2020 will have its notoriety and it will be remembered for, that we will remember these strange realities we're living through presently, but I am hoping it will ultimately improve and we will not be comparing it to something so difficult as 1968. So as we talk about the reasons for the tumult, right? As we talk about the reasons that the 1960s probably aren't a decade that Americans should be nostalgic for. I mentioned that the other day. We really do have to hone in on the sequences of these events. So you've got, the Vietnam War really taking off in 1964 and 1965 after the Gulf of Tonkin incident and the uptick in the numbers of American troops by 1968 and 69. We have the civil rights movement, which of course I think we all understand was an essential good for the United States, especially if we look at the civil rights movement through the lens of Dr. King and his peaceful orientations, the avoidance as often as possible, the avoidance of confrontation that he sought, and the idea of a greater amount of harmony in our country that would hopefully be created and be the reality moving forward. The civil rights movement is certainly a benchmark and an inherent positive, but you also do have to remember that for many Americans, it was a massive change that needed to happen, absolutely, but change nonetheless. And a lot of Americans were not really prepared for those changes. So there's a fair amount of upheaval, even because of the civil rights movement, although I think we would all argue that it was necessary. We have a couple of other things that we have to talk about, though. So we've got these changes in American society that are happening. We've got the onset of Vietnam. We've got the death of Kennedy, right? The assassination of Kennedy. That's a major moment in time. We've got the onset of the Vietnam War. We've got the push for the civil rights legislation and the movement more broadly by Dr. King. We have LBJ's Great Society that is coming into its own, and a great deal of legislation passed for that society, the creation of many federal agencies that oversee that legislation. But we see that all the change creates questioning. And a lot of Americans on various sides, right? So not just Black Americans and white Americans, an increasing percentage. Sorry, we've got apparently my neighbor has decided to use a circular saw all of a sudden. Sorry about that. I apologize. The guy's been doing that way too much. Always pleasant. So what was I saying? You know what? I can't hear what I'm wanting to say, so I'm just going to close these windows. Sorry, guys. What a strange video this will be when you guys watch it. Okay, now I can at least hear myself without a circular saw in the background. So 1968 is kind of this weird culmination point where all, the Americans on the different sides of the divide are sometimes coming into conflict with one another. There's a lot of upset. There's a lot of questions about the end of the Vietnam War. There are questions about where that war is going. There are questions about, you know, the whole environment of race relations in America that are at the forefront of Americans' minds. And 1968 proves to be a very challenging year. So it begins with the Tet Offensive, which we've already talked about, so I don't need to go back through it right now. But there's also another important moment in April of '68. You need to know, very, very important moment in American history. Dr. King is assassinated. And obviously that assassination has a deep effect on the American mindset at the time. It goes without saying that all of Dr. King's supporters were just deeply affected and horribly upset by his murder. There was talk that his murder would set back the civil rights movement for the foreseeable future, and that a lot of the progress that had been made would be nullified or it would be dramatically lessened. And for the most part, that didn't happen, thankfully, but there certainly were consequences and there were some setbacks. It's a tragedy of epic proportions because of who Dr. King was as a leader for the movement. Specifically, his constant reminders about the importance of engaging in the change and pushing for greater equality through peaceful means in order to guarantee that Americans were actually going to find ways to relate to one another and to understand one another far more effectively through the process. If you have, there were a lot of other leaders who were certainly not pushing that agenda, and they were actually interested in much more volatile and violent courses of action. So this is a huge moment when Dr. King is assassinated. Later on in the summer, okay, so you've got the 1968 is a presidential election year. Okay, this is very important. So the almost assuredly the Democratic candidate was going to be Robert Kennedy. In fact, that would have happened. Robert Kennedy, who is John F. Kennedy's younger brother, who had served as Attorney General for a time in his brother's administration. So Robert Kennedy is running for the Democratic nomination for the presidency, and he is assassinated in 1968. And just playing some political hypotheticals here, I think it's important to at least note, there's virtually no political scientist that I'm aware of who argues that if Kennedy had lived, if Robert Kennedy had survived, and he went up against Richard Nixon for the presidency in November of 1968, few people believe that Richard Nixon would have won. But Nixon did win. The consequences of Nixon's victory are mixed. It's not all about Watergate. So Nixon's legacy goes far beyond Watergate. There are some really good things that Nixon did accomplish, but obviously the trauma of the Watergate scandal is something that the United States had real trouble moving through and moving beyond. And we could have been spared that if Robert Kennedy had indeed been elected president. I personally believe Robert Kennedy and his brother both were moderates, and I think there would have been a greater chance at some meaningful domestic and foreign policies under Robert Kennedy that just never came to fruition because, of course, he was killed. These are immensely important moments. So that's the lower left part of the screen. On the lower right part of the screen, you have rioting at the Democratic National Convention in my home state and near my hometown of Wheaton. So this is the Democratic National Convention, which was held in Chicago that year in 1968, and massive riots. And police were, arresting people and putting them down with batons and trying to defend themselves. There was bloodshed. This is all happening as Americans are watching a lot of these things on television. They're watching the news reporting. And I'm sure my parents, I can tell you, when I asked them about this, they were aghast at at their own country and felt like America was beginning to come apart at the seams with a lot of these crazed events and the anarchy that seemed to be prevailing at the time. So I do want you to be aware of that. Some important, very important events in 1968, and that's why it's often referred to as one of the most tumultuous years in American history. And here's where I'm going to end for the day, because I do want to, actually what I'm going to do next on Friday is we're going to dip into the 1970s, and I'm going to try to frame the Watergate scandal, but also moving beyond that and talking about the end of the Vietnam War and some of the other domestic and foreign crises that really seized upon the American consciousness in the 1970s. So I think it's safe to leave that for Friday. I want to frame that a little bit more specifically then. But, you know, one of the things that students who are in our classes now, one of the things that they're seemingly drawn to without question is the countercultural movement of the 1960s and the flower children, right? And the Deadheads, right? The devotees that began to follow the Grateful Dead and other bands around the country, and the peace marches. And in the lower right-hand corner of the slide, I've got Jimi Hendrix on the screen there, and the counterculture is often, I think, rightly associated not just with, you know, music and the youthful generation and with concerns about government policy in places like Vietnam, but also through this lens of protest. It's a much more holistic orientation. And what I mean by that is this. So when we talk about the counterculture of the 1960s, the protests being made are often misidentified or maybe misconstrued to be just about politics, just about, say, the Johnson administration and then the Nixon administration with things like Vietnam. Those protests did exist. Those protests were part of that counterculture movement, but the counterculture existed as much more than that. And a lot of it revolved around like youthful generations in decades past. We could probably make some similar comparisons to youth in the 1920s, actually, which was a pretty riotous decade for American youth. The counterculture in the 1960s is definitely fighting tradition. They're not just aiming their angst at politicians like Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson. They're aiming their angst at their own parents, their own families, their own ministers in their churches. And there is this notion that that there was so much opportunity following the end of World War II, so much opportunity for peace and prosperity and harmony, and yet the counterculture movement is built upon the notion that this youthful generation that's emerging in the 1960s, that's coming into their own, leaving their teen years and entering adulthood in the 1960s, that they've been sold out, that they have been undermined, that they have largely been failed by their own parents and their own grandparents, that those generations have failed miserably to create this world of peace and prosperity that the youth of the 1960s were so desiring. I would say that I think we all understand a certain desire for measures of harmony and some measures of peaceful coexistence and interaction. But what I would also say is this: a lot of the countercultural activists of the 1960s were writing and singing and speaking in terms of a utopianism that ironically set that very generation that was rebelling and protesting and countering, it set them up for a great deal of disappointment and disillusionment of their own. And so the countercultural utopianism is something that's often referenced here. The elements of utopianism that were embraced by so many, when those ideas, even, you know, even when they themselves came to positions of authority and power and became CEOs of corporations themselves, or went into politics and became political leaders, or became entrepreneurial businessmen and businesswomen, or lawyers, or whatever they became, the 60s generation ultimately came to realize that they were probably a little bit too harsh in their critiques of their parents and grandparents' generations, given the fact that they themselves were not able to produce the levels of the utopian visions that they so vehemently sought and that they were so loudly declaring in the 1960s. And so I just think it's important to have the context. That's kind of part of youth, I suppose. I think every generation questions the meaningfulness and the they tend to question the applications of the previous generation. There's this element of rebellion that's just kind of seemingly built into our DNA in some level, I suppose. And I think we've all been through it. I certainly spent some time trying to, you know, argue against my parents and what they and their generation had accomplished. And there were days in my youth when I seemed to have a chip on my shoulder and had a fair amount of resentment against, you know, my parents' generation. And part of that is natural, and I think we all get that. But the 1960s countercultural generation, I think because of their zealous commitments to these notions of utopianism and peace and harmony and a world that, you know, John Lennon would sing about, right? We just heard this, you know, posts of this famous song Imagine, right? So Lennon's song Imagine. You know, people are taking these concepts and trying to figure out ways to make them quite literal. And for the Christian, I think one of the important things to remind ourselves of here is that, of course, measures of peace, so certain elements, partial in nature, can be sought, that there are degrees of harmony between peoples that can be accomplished, but it's in degrees. It is partial. It is not complete. There will be conflict. There will be wars. There will be death. There will be frustration. There will be corruption in our world, and it is important to live in a way that recognizes those realities and still tries to contend in meaningful ways at times, but also recognizes that humanity is fallen. And, you know, I think for many who were caught up in the secularized countercultural activities and the protests and the utopianism, they became such distraught human beings by the late 70s and on into the 80s, when their original visions had fallen by the wayside and the world seemed to have moved on without them, in a sense, moved on without asking permission from this countercultural generation of the 1960s that had sought so much change. So really interesting formats for us to try to understand here. Okay, guys, that's it for me for right now. So I'm going to post this, and you'll be able to access this for class on Wednesday the 15th, and be looking for my next post on the 1970s for Friday the 17th. And I will also be posting some study suggestions for the final exam on Friday. All right, guys, have a good rest of your day. See ya.